Darby, Connecticut, late spring 1871. The air is thick with river damp, and the sweet rot smell of Milltown summer beginning to rise from the low streets. In a modest household where grief has already made a home for itself, a man named Horatio N. Sherman drinks with the exhausted carelessness of a widower who has tried to outpace sorrow with liquor. He has remarried quickly, as men often did when children needed a woman's hands in the house. Now there is a new wife at the hearth. Quiet, capable, practiced in nursing and domestic management. The sort of woman whose competence becomes its own disguise. Her name is Lydia Sherman, born Lydia Danbury in New Jersey, and in her presence the ordinary objects of a home, bottles, cups, powders, milk pans, begin to carry a second life. When Horatio takes ill, it comes on with an ugliness that frightens the room. Burning pain across the stomach and chest, violent vomiting, a helpless swelling of the face and eyes, a collapse that doesn't behave like common sickness. He has seen sickness before. Darby has seen it too. Cholera summers, influenza seasons, childhood fevers that can snatch a life overnight. But this is different. This is not the slow narrative of disease. This feels like a chemical betrayal, as if the body has been set upon from within by something that was invited in. Source. And then, what makes this case so chilling, there are the graves, not one grave, several. A baby boy, Frankie, dead. A teenage daughter, Ada, dead. Horatio himself dead. Deaths close enough together to look, even to a cautious 19th century mind, less like misfortune and more like pattern. One physician, Dr. J.C. Beardsley, takes the risk that many do not. He refuses to let the story end as God's will. He demands examination. He demands proof. He sends organs for chemical analysis. And what comes back is the word that will ignite an entire region's fear of domestic poisoning. Arsenic. This is where Lydia Sherman becomes more than a woman and turns into a headline creature. The Darby poisoner, the Poison Fiend, the modern Lucretia Borgia. And yet behind the lurid language sits a quieter, more horrifying truth. Her method, if the state is right, required no knife, no gun, no overt violence. It required proximity, trust, routine, and the invisibility of women's work. If you want more evidence-driven historical cases told in a literary archival style, subscribe and turn on notifications. This series follows the paper trail. Autopsies, witness statements, courtroom logic, and the small domestic objects that become weapons. Lydia Sherman's story begins far from Connecticut's factory towns. She was born December 24, 1824 in Burlington, New Jersey, orphaned early, and raised by relatives. An origin that left her with little protection and little permanence. She learned to work young, first as a tailor, then in the broader economy of women's labor. Caregiving, nursing, housekeeping, roles that placed her inside other people's private rooms, beside their beds, in charge of their food, their medicine, their last fragile hours. These positions required trust. They also offered access. Source. At 17, Lydia married her first husband, Edward Struck. What followed, if later confessions and reconstructions are even partly true, was not simply domestic unhappiness, but domestic erasure. Struck lost work, sank into depression, and Lydia later claimed she poisoned him. Soon, children began to die, one after another, under the soft cover of ordinary 19th century explanations. Fever, typhoid, childhood illness. In an era where child mortality was tragically common, death could hide in plain sight. A mother's grief was assumed, suspicion was rare. That assumption may have been Lydia Sherman's first and greatest protection. The narrative that gathered around her was one of repeated reinvention. Widowhood, new town, new role, new household. She moved from New Jersey and New York into Connecticut, and each move allowed the past to loosen its grip. The record that would later be assembled against her reads like a grim ledger of domestic transitions. Husband, children, inheritance. Whether every death attributed to her truly belonged to her hand remains debated in details. But the public identity that formed was unmistakable. A woman who walked through households leaving fewer living behind. This case is horrifying not only because it involves poisoning, but because its alleged victims include the people who are meant, by every cultural instinct, to be safest beside a woman's hands. Husbands and children. Sources differ on exact totals, but the recurring core is consistent. 3 husbands and multiple children in her care, some her own, some stepchildren, with later accounts often stating 8 children and 3 husbands, and overall totals sometimes reaching 10 or 11. To tell this story responsibly means pausing to remember the victims as more than numbers. There is Frankie, the infant son in the Sherman household, whose short life ended before it could widen into memory. There is Ada, a teenage girl on the edge of adulthood whose death shattered her father and left a home psychologically hollow before poison ever entered the coroner's language. There is Horatio Sherman, a widower who remarried not for romance but for survival, who likely believed he was securing stability for his children, and instead may have placed them under lethal care. And then there is Dennis Hurlburt, an older, wealthier man in Connecticut whom Lydia married after working as a caregiver, a relationship described in the sources as driven by property more than attraction. He altered his will. He fell ill. He died. If the prosecution narrative is accepted, his death becomes another example of a pattern. Intimacy turned transactional. Caregiving turned predatory. The tragedy of this case is that its victims were not strangers who could be easily forgotten by towns. They were family, and their deaths were supposed to be private griefs. Lydia Sherman's story transformed those private griefs into public spectacle, an entire region staring at the idea that the home, rather than being the refuge from violence, could be the mechanism of it. The 19th century feared poison the way later centuries feared strangers with knives. Poison belonged to the familiar. It moved through kitchens, sick rooms, and cups of tea. Arsenic was widely available, often sold for rats and pests, and it had a terrifying versatility. It could be administered in small amounts over time, producing symptoms that mimicked common gastrointestinal illness, vomiting, cramps, weakness, until accumulation became fatal. In communities where doctors were limited and diagnostic certainty rare, arsenic could masquerade as nature. Yet by the 1870s, chemistry was becoming a courtroom weapon. Yale-trained physicians and scientific analysts began to treat the body as evidence. In Lydia Sherman's case, organs were analyzed, bodies were exhumed. Chemical testimony became central. This is why her story sits at the intersection of 2 eras. An older world where women could kill invisibly through domestic access, and an emerging world where science began, imperfectly but powerfully, to drag invisible crimes into light. In each household Lydia entered, first as wife, later as nurse or housekeeper, the structure was similar. A male head of household, children requiring care, routines dependent on one woman's competence. Food and drink passed through her hands. Medicine passed through her hands. The sickbed, where a person becomes too weak to question, became the most private stage of all. This is what makes domestic poisoning so uniquely horrifying. It weaponizes care itself. In the Sherman household specifically, Horatio's drinking mattered. One account describes his liquor as the vehicle for poison. Another detail adds a cruelly domestic twist. Lydia later claimed Horatio may have accidentally ingested arsenic prepared for the children, mistaking it for saleratus, a baking compound that could foam when mixed with cider. Whether that claim was self-serving or truthful, it illustrates the core vulnerability. In a kitchen, powders are ordinary. Their danger can be hidden behind their familiarity. The warning signs were not one dramatic event, but an accumulation of uneasy facts. A baby dies. A teenage daughter dies. A husband dies. The sequence compresses time in a way that makes coincidence harder to believe. And then there is the legal shift that often appears in poisoning stories. Wills altered, property redirected, the quiet movement of assets from the living to the caregiver. Dennis Hurlburt, after marrying Lydia, altered his will and left everything to her. He soon took ill and died. Few suspected at the time, but later, that sequence looked like motive turned into method. In the Struck household earlier, multiple children died in a period where child deaths could be dismissed as epidemic misfortune. That dismissal may have been Lydia's shield. Communities normalized tragedy, and tragedy protected the killer. It is one of the bleakest truths in historical true crime. Poverty and high mortality rates can function as camouflage. Arsenic is a metallic poison, tasteable sometimes, but easily hidden in strong flavors or liquids and devastatingly effective. It produces violent gastrointestinal distress, burning sensations, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, collapse, and finally death. In Lydia Sherman's story, arsenic appears as the common thread linking multiple deaths across multiple homes. The prosecution's logic was simple. The symptoms matched. The chemical findings matched. The deaths clustered where Lydia was positioned closest to food, drink, and medicine. Source: the case also shows how arsenic moved through 19th century supply chains. Sold as rat poison, kept in homes, stored in paper packets, accessible without the modern stigma that would later surround it. The poison was not an exotic substance. It was a household item, one that could be turned with intent into a murder weapon. The suffering described in arsenic cases is not the quick violence of a blade. It is the slow betrayal of the body by something it consumed in trust. Victims experience burning pain, relentless vomiting, cramps, exhaustion, swelling, and terror. The horror is not only physical but psychological. The victim may not know they are being killed. They may believe they are simply sick. They may keep accepting food and drink from the very person administering their death. In the Sherman home, Horatio's death triggered professional suspicion. It was the kind of death that refused to behave like natural causes. And once the chemical analysis confirmed arsenic, prior deaths were reread in a new language. Not grief, but evidence. Not misfortune, but a pattern with an author. The dead in this case were made to speak through chemistry. If you're following the evidence with me, comment arsenic. Because from this point forward, the case stops being rumor and becomes paperwork. Exhumations, lab findings, courtroom testimony, and a scientific trail that Lydia couldn't charm away. The turning point in Lydia Sherman's story is the moment a physician refuses the convenience of the ordinary. Dr. Beardsley, connected to Yale, ordered an autopsy after Horatio Sherman's abrupt death. When arsenic was discovered, he did not stop there. He ordered exhumations. The Sherman children's bodies were examined. Dennis Hurlburt's body was examined. Poison was found again. This is the pivot from suspicion to systemic inquiry. The case expands backward in time, pulling earlier deaths into the orbit of the current one. At the center of this discovery is the new authority of chemical analysis. Rather than relying solely on symptoms and hearsay, investigators relied on the emerging forensic ability to detect poison in organs and remains. Lydia Sherman's case became a headline precisely because it showcased that new power. The state could now interrogate the corpse with science. Once poison was confirmed, Lydia did what many accused people did when the story became too sharp. She moved. She was arrested in New Brunswick, New Jersey in June 1871, with later proceedings culminating in Connecticut. Authorities pursued extradition, building a case from bodies, documents, and the sequence of deaths. The investigation had to do what poison cases always require: prove not only that poison existed, but that Lydia was the agent through which it entered the household. The press amplified everything. Lydia Sherman's notoriety was multiplied by America's fascination with female poisoners. She was cast as an American Borgia, her crimes portrayed as both monstrous and strangely domestic, as though her gender made the violence more shocking and therefore more marketable. This public hunger produced books and pamphlets, including sensational texts that positioned her confession as entertainment for an eager audience. Source: the strongest spine of the case was chemical evidence, organs examined, arsenic found, patterns established across multiple bodies. Smithsonian collections preserve material related to the chemical examination in the Sherman poisoning case, illustrating that contemporary observers treated it as a significant moment in forensic history. Poison detection as courtroom certainty. Yet even as science advanced, the 19th century courtroom remained imperfect. Legal outcomes depended not only on chemistry, but on what could be proven beyond procedural doubt. Lydia was convicted of second-degree murder rather than first, in part because of how evidence and intent were interpreted. The state had poison, it had pattern. It still had to package guilt into the legal categories available at the time. By the time Lydia Sherman faced court, the public narrative had already declared her the embodiment of poison fear. Newspapers and pamphlets offered grand titles and lurid adjectives. This matters because it shapes how a defendant is seen, not as a person under accusation, but as a symbol. Lydia was not simply a woman charged with murder. She was America's Poison Fiend. The title itself was a verdict in prose. She waited confined while the state prepared its case and the public devoured her story. In that waiting period, an interval where the living defendant remains silent and the dead are made to speak, society builds the moral scaffolding that the courtroom will later formalize. Source: Lydia Sherman was tried in New Haven. Accounts describe the proceedings as sensational, with public fascination fueled by the scope of alleged crimes, husbands, children, repeated deaths, and an accused woman who had moved between identities and households. The prosecution presented the timeline and the toxicological findings. The defense pushed on what could be definitively proven and what remained circumstantial. In the end, Lydia was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Degree conviction matters. It suggests the court accepted guilt, but framed it within a category that did not demand proof of premeditation to the highest threshold. That legal nuance is part of the case's mystery, because it leaves space for the public to continue debating how much Lydia did and how far the evidence truly reached. In 1873, Judge Sanford sentenced Lydia Sherman to life in Wethersfield State Prison. It should have been the end of the story. Poison identified, killer removed, society reassured. But Lydia did not disappear quietly into incarceration. The prison became another stage for her defining trait: the ability to simulate, manipulate, and slip through systems built by complacent people. The legend of Lydia Sherman grew even behind bars. Later reporting emphasized her cunning, her performance of illness, the idea that deception was not an act for her but a condition, something she lived in as naturally as other people lived in truth. Source: if you want the next script in this exact archival pattern, cold open, victim memorial, evidence chain, and a symbolic object motif, type next case and tell me which poisoner or era you want: Victorian, Edwardian, or early American. In June 1877, Lydia Sherman escaped from prison. The details vary in tone. Some accounts emphasize a careless matron, others highlight Lydia's own preparation and disguise, but the narrative is consistent. She exploited weakness in supervision and fled into the outside world. For a brief time, she reached Providence, Rhode Island, even attempting to establish herself again as a housekeeper, returning to the very role that had granted her access in the first place. It is a chilling loop. The social position that allegedly enabled her crimes was the same position she sought again upon escape. Was recaptured after being recognized or caught in inconsistencies, returned to prison and watched more closely. The escape did not free her. It amplified her legend. It suggested that even imprisonment could not fully contain her, and it fed the public appetite for stories of cunning female criminals who could act their way past systems designed by men who underestimated them. Lydia Sherman died in prison on May 16, 1878. Some accounts specify cancer as the cause. The irony is sharp enough to feel scripted. A woman branded as a poisoner did not meet her end through poison but through prolonged illness. The slow bodily betrayal she inflicted upon others. The public, however, was never interested in her natural death. The public wanted narrative symmetry, confession, repentance, spectacle. Lydia's ending offered none of that. Her legacy endured in print. Sensational books and pamphlets like The Poison Fiend circulated her story widely, blending fact, confession culture, and public fascination into a marketable object. In this way, Lydia Sherman's crimes, or alleged crimes beyond conviction, became part of America's true crime publishing tradition. The murderer as commodity, the courtroom as entertainment, the dead as proof and spectacle. Every case in this series carries a symbolic object, an ordinary thing transformed into a vessel of death. For Lydia Sherman, that object is the arsenic powder itself. Pale, granular, mundane enough to pass as household substance, deadly enough to erase families. It represents the 19th century terror of invisible crime. Something you could sprinkle into oatmeal, stir into cider, dissolve into liquor, and leave behind only stomach pain and a grave. It is the physical manifestation of betrayal through care. And arsenic is also symbolic of the era's shifting relationship to truth. It is the substance that forced the courtroom to listen to chemistry. It is the reason bodies were exhumed, organs sent to analysts, and scientific testimony elevated. In Lydia Sherman's case, arsenic is not only the alleged weapon, it is the hinge between rumor and proof. The Lydia Sherman case leaves haunting questions that are not fully resolved by conviction alone. How many victims were truly hers? She confessed to 3 husbands and 4 children in one account, while broader narratives claim higher totals. 8 children, perhaps 10 or 11 victims overall. Why the discrepancy? Was it exaggeration by sensational publishers, or limitation of proof within legal proceedings, or Lydia's own strategic framing of confession? How did she last so long without suspicion? The answer may lie in the era's assumptions. That mothers do not murder children, that wives nurse husbands through illness rather than create it, that high child mortality makes patterns harder to recognize, and that a woman moving between households could shed suspicion as easily as she shed her name. Lydia Sherman's story, whether taken as full truth or partially mythologized truth, exposes a grim vulnerability. The home can be both sanctuary and crime scene, and the very roles meant to protect, wife, nurse, housekeeper, can become the perfect disguise for harm. And finally, what does it mean that her case became entertainment? That her confession could be printed and sold? That her crimes, real, alleged, or inflated, were turned into a consumable horror story? Perhaps the most chilling legacy of Lydia Sherman is that the public did not only fear her. The public wanted her, wanted the story, wanted the titles, wanted the thrill of poison contained safely on paper while real families lay in the ground. If you want, I can also provide a thumbnail pack reference list using authentic period visuals already identified for this case, like Lydia Sherman's archival images and Poison Fiend book imagery, and a B-roll beat map aligned to these 18 sections.